You know, it'd be great, a constitutional amendment to say, limit the terms of members of Congress. Term limits in the Constitution. Everybody likes that idea. People like that idea. What about an amendment to balance the budget? I think that's good too. You know who hates these ideas? These guys, members of Congress. They don't want to change a damn thing. And whatever they change, they have their own agenda. It doesn't seem to be our agenda. But changing the Constitution is a great big pain in the neck. First, you got to get like almost all of them to agree, and almost every single state to agree, and they kind of drive the process, Congress. But maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. There is another way to change the Constitution that's actually in the Constitution that does not receive nearly enough attention. It is a passion of my next guest, the former United States Senator from Pennsylvania, Republican Rick Santorum, and very successful presidential candidate back in the day. More about that later. Senator Santorum, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Gray.
How does this thing work? There's an easier way to change the Constitution, potentially.
Well, it's not easy. As you mentioned before, it's really hard to do, but it should be hard to change the Constitution. The problem is it hasn't been, because the progressives, using the Supreme Court, have amended the Constitution over and over and over again without changing a word of the Constitution. But the only way to get that back, the only way to change that, is for conservatives to rise up. Well, they're not going to do it in Washington. In 1787, 2 days before the end of the convention, George Mason stood up and said, "Are we so naive to believe that Congress should be the only ones who can propose amendments, that if Washington or the federal government would become a tyranny, that the Congress would come to rescue us from that tyranny?" And so they came together and they proposed Section 2 of Article 5, which gave the state legislatures the power, apart from Congress, to call a convention. It takes 2/3 of the state legislatures, governors aren't involved, 2/3 of the state legislatures of the states have to call a convention for the same purpose. And in the case that you were just mentioning, the purpose that I'm fighting for is to limit terms, to put fiscal limitations, and to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Those would be the three topics that would be eligible to be proposed at a convention. So 34 states have to agree to do so. Right now, the convention of states is at 19 states have already agreed to do this. If we get to 34, a convention is automatically called. All 50 states can send delegates. And then at that convention, the delegates to that convention, every state gets one vote. At that convention, amendments are considered. 26 states have to agree to propose an amendment. If an amendment, let's say term limits, let's say a term limit amendment is proposed, it is then sent to the states for ratification. It takes then 3/4 of the states, 38 states, have to then, both houses of the legislature have to approve that to be added to the Constitution. So it's really hard to do. It takes amendments that have broad consensus, because you're going to need red states and probably some purple states and maybe even a blue state or two to get to 38. So it's something that has to be, a consensus issue in the American public. People say, well, what could happen? I give one example. An amendment that would say that the Supreme Court is limited to 9 members. Now you say, well, that's not a big deal, but it is a big deal, because it's something that some left-wing president and left-wing Congress could do to completely destroy the country by court packing. And if you stop that by constitutional amendment, you can at least stop one horrible thing potentially from happening to this country.
All right. It is still complicated, as you mentioned. It's hard. Tell me succinctly what the key advantage, though, is that it originates with the states,
yes,
not with Congress.
It originates with the states, and it's ended with the states. The Congress has no role to play whatsoever in this process. The president has no role to play. And interestingly enough, the governors have no role to play. And the beautiful thing is, it's one state, one vote. What's that mean? That the small states, conservative states, have an advantage over any other form of changing the Constitution, number one. And number two, to ratify it, again, there are a lot more conservative states than there are numerically. As you look at them, always look at the map for president, you say, wow, this is a big Republican state, because most of the map is red. Well, that's because most of the states are red. So the legislatures are always tilted toward Republicans. And you find that even in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and states that are purple states, are generally controlled by Republicans, because the Democratic vote is all concentrated in the city, and the Republicans then control most of the state. So it's actually the best forum for conservative ideas to get addressed.
So we can change the swamp
Yes.
outside of the swamp.
Outside the swamp.
This is great.
It's
And
great stuff.
You can go to conventionofstates.com. This is the group you're affiliated with, and some great conservatives as well, Mark Levin and more.
Yeah.
This is, I mean, and it's been sitting there for what, 200 and
Never
how old
been
is it?
used. It's been tried many times, but they've never been able to get to those 34 states. It's hard. It's hard to do, and you need a national movement, and that's what we're trying to get going.
Well, I think it's awesome, and George Mason, wherever you are, great idea, great idea indeed. Rick Santorum, we appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Have a great weekend.
We'll be right back.